This one's an interesting discussion. I meet people all the time that say, young people are carrying knives, they're in situations where they're joining groups, they're joining gangs, and everywhere I go to, the conversation is gangs, criminal exploitation, young people becoming more and more violent. And I guess as a researcher and as a individual that works within the local community, I think that these are some really interesting points. And I always say, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't a 13, 14-year-old carry a knife in this particular society right now? And I think I say that almost to get us to think a little bit more critical, because I know there are going to be individuals watching this video that either are youth workers, key stakeholders in their local community, individuals that are thinking about how can they help with the work that people like myself and others do around the country to solve this problem of knife crime. There may be parents that are thinking, well, I've lost my child, or I want to be an individual that also advocates because my son or daughter was a victim of a particular issue. There may be individuals that are like, our organization want to safeguard children and young people and families, and we want to help and support. And there might be even educational institutions are like, well, how can we raise the awareness? And regardless of who is watching this video and the reason and motivations to why I've made this particular statement, why wouldn't they, is to get us to be really critical about why not. Let's think about what's happened. Now we can just go back just for a historical lens for a moment. We're talking about post 2009-10, where we changed from a Labour government into a conservative government. David Cameron, if you remember, was talking about the broken society, and all of these different things started to happen. Following that, a couple of years ago, we had the disturbances of 2011. Some people would call it the riot. Some people use the word disturbances. Doesn't matter. We remember 2011, a lot of stuff was going on. 2012, what we started to notice was almost like a birth in kind of new thinking and new ways, which kind of shaped the way in which austerity and the cuts within services of youth and community services, services around supporting children and young people, mental health, the police were cut left, right, and center. And this new society that the Tories essentially were trying to build and make up actually had impacts in a range of different types of ways. So from a youth work perspective, when we talk about austerity and the cuts, what happened in youth services is what we started to see was that loads of youth community centres were being closed. So the bigger centres would remain open, and the smaller, what we would call satellite centres within the community would essentially shut down, and with the hope that everybody moved to these big hubs. Now, one of the arguments that we were essentially promoting or presenting was that whilst the thinking of going into the big hubs makes sense, one of the things that you're not taking into consideration, and when I'm saying you, I'm talking about the councils, for example, statutory bodies. What we're not taking into consideration is that those little small satellite centres were in the root and the root of particular communities, that those small, even marginalised communities that generally were new, that probably wasn't getting that much attention, or they wasn't having access to particular types of resources. Those particular small communities are not essentially going to go to the big hubs. Then you've got to take into consideration geographical space. In one of the other videos, I spoke about the fact that many groups within society are very territorial. So if you've now removed a small satellite center building in a particular area, now you're expecting for somebody to go to a building, let's say 4 miles away. Even in that 4-mile radius, there may be so many amenities within a particular community or a particular community uses that's essentially now being stripped away, and you're forcing people to essentially cross lines. And what I look at in terms of a researcher is when people cross those particular lines, what can essentially happen? And in one of my other previous videos, I spoke about the concept of race, class, gender, intersectionality, culture, belief systems, religion, and all of those different things that make up the different intersections of us within the society has to be seen in the context of when we move these things away, what essentially can happen. So going back to the subject of that particular historical timeline, all of those different changes, for example, happened. I use youth work and youth and community services as an example. What we also started to notice was, whilst those buildings were being shut, the youth workers that were working in those particular areas and communities and environments weren't able to reach particular young people, because what started to happen was people only were working with certain types of young people based on that geographical space. So one of the things that we started to also notice was that more and more young people stopped going to the big centers, and they started to hang around much more in their local communities where those particular youth centers essentially used to be. Fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, one of the things that we started to notice among young people was there is an increase in fighting, an increase in antisocial behavior, an increase in robberies, an increase in young people being extorted. And then we started to see the increase of young people carrying weapons or arming themselves to carry weapons in order to survive. Now, the word survival is really interesting, because when I've done research and surveys to ask young people the question, why are you carrying knives? It's interesting that the narrative is almost identical to young people across the country. And what young people are saying is that they don't feel safe. And as a consequence of closures of buildings in their little area in which they live, is that they're feeling that being out and about and not being able to go to those centers because they're not as close as they want to be, forces them to be out in the street, on the parks, in the subways, hanging outside the local shops or supermarkets. And that also is a cause of concern for business owners. And those mass groups of different young people that are just hanging about because they've got nothing to do. For those of you that look at sociological theory and the criminological theories, definitely know wherever there's boredom, there's always going to be issues around antisocial behaviors. Wherever there's somewhere for young people not to do or not allowed to do, or things are being closed, is going to have a direct correlation to those behaviors that we see and a cause of concern. But then what's the narrative? Because if the narrative is now become young people in those environments where there's nothing for them to do because of cuts, youth workers, community workers are not being paid to work in those particular environments, to work with all young people, whereas a big building or a number of buildings in a local locality will be able to reach as many young people as possible, to educate them, to help them raise awareness about the issues, to if they needed help and support to do their mental health or their mental well-being, there was support within those particular little hubs or those buildings. That's all being stripped away because of austerity. And now we've got young people essentially using the word, as I said just previously, surviving. And the narrative has now become part and part of youth culture, where young people believe in the narrative that if I need to be safe in my little environment, everybody else is carrying weapons, therefore I interpret that as, well, I need to carry a weapon too. Then we've got issues in those same communities nationally, that in those small tight-knit communities, those individuals that are also trying to survive, some of them are actually involved in criminal behaviors. Some of those individuals are involved in gangs. Some of those individuals are involved in counter lines and criminal exploitation. Some of those individuals are being radicalized by whether it's the far right or religious groups, whatever that may be. You've got groups of individuals that live within the same environment that also believe the same and push the same particular narrative. So you may have a 13 or 14-year-old young person that's just trying to make their way to school and hears about what happens in the local community in terms of the increase of violence, the increase of criminal behaviors, but there's also a decrease in help and support. And there's only so much that some parents are able to do to support their children. You go to school, and schools talks about raising the awareness of knife crime, raising the awareness of carrying weapons. The police come in and talk a lot about what happens if you get caught. But one of the things that oftentimes doesn't happen in those environments, no one does actually think about what are the strategies. What are the strategies that we can utilize with young people to get them to think about ways in which they can keep them safe? So we raise loads of awareness, which I talk about in my work, in my research around consequences work. We're very good at consequences work. We're very good at telling young people about what they shouldn't do. We're very good at telling young people about the consequences if they engage in particular behaviors. But one of the things that we don't do is give people enough strategies, ways, building their resilience, that if they find themselves in a situation or scenario, this is what they do. And what I find when I do those surveys is speaking to young people, when we talk about survival, there's two things that always come up: fear and anxiety. A lot of young people are scared. A lot of young people are scared and anxious to worry their parents. So therefore they're out in the community, they're in school, they're in college, carrying weapons because they believe in a perceived notion that something may happen, or something's happened in the community that's give them enough information to make the decision that they need to carry the weapon, then I'm going to go back to what I said in terms of how does the state, how does society, how does the system respond? And oftentimes it's in a punitive way. So we tell young people, you do that, this is what happens. You're found with a knife, you get kicked out. You get found with a knife, you're going to get permanently excluded. And all those things on paper sound great, but one of the things that we don't oftentimes take the time to really look at is each individual perspective, each individual incident, where actually I believe that we actually can utilize our common sense. We actually can be a little bit due diligent in looking at what the different reasons are. Because I know young people, as a final point, that carry weapons not because they want to be involved in criminality, not because they want to join a group that's involved in criminality. They've carried a weapon because they're scared, or they carry a weapon because their friends carry weapons and it becomes a fashionable, youth, popular thing to do. And I believe those two categories of individuals are not the same as individuals that go out with the intention to hurt and harm and threaten other children and young people. So in that context, I think it's really hard sometimes when you have children and young people trying to gather their thoughts, trying to navigate their way through a society that may be seen as dangerous, may be seen as uneasy, may be seen as scary. And that's why I flipped the question in the beginning, why wouldn't they? Because if I put myself in the shoes of the 13, 14, 15-year-old young people that I engage every single day, not criminals, by the way, when I speak to them, they talk about those fears. They speak about that anxiety. So my role as a youth work practitioner, but also as an advisor to organizations that work with young people, it can't just be about raising awareness. We have to start thinking about how do we engage with young people to give them the strategies, build that resilience within them to start thinking about why they shouldn't carry a weapon. But until we come up with those solutions much better within our society, I'm still gonna say, why shouldn't they? So today's subject was really interesting, and one that, as you heard me say, is something that loads and loads of people ask me and talk about, young people carrying knives, and I've asked the question, why wouldn't they? And I guess the first person that comes to mind is Elijah Anderson's work, Code of the Streets. I really tell people it'd be really, really good if you can get that book, because it really puts things in perspective, and some of the other things that I've spoke about on this series would be really good. But there's a really interesting book that I picked up a little while back by Dr. Rich, and the book was called Wrong Place, Wrong Time. And it really was just kind of looking at trauma and violence in the lives of young people. And I thought it was really good. I mean, the author really talks about the lens of black young people, but it really gave context to young people we work with in general. And one of the things I was talking about in today's segment was about the narrative, the thoughts that's now become popular culture. And one of the things that you find with a lot of young people that are navigating their way through communities is that they find themselves in geographical locations that may be hotspots because there's beef, there's issues. And Code of the Streets, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, along with some of the other books that I've mentioned in some of the previous videos, Researching Gangs, for example, would be ideal to look at. And then obviously you've heard me use my criminological books and some of my sociological books as well for theoretical ideas and underpinnings. But as I always say, think about the theoretical ideas and the models that you're using through a intersectional lens, and it will just make your work 10 times better.